Just a few logistics before we start. One is that we do want to hear from all of you, so don't take it personally, as I always say, that I muted you. You all have a chat on your Zoom, and any questions or comments that you'd like, please put them in that. Also, for those of you who would like, we have CEU certificates for any teachers out there. So if you are interested in receiving those, please just email me. I'll put that in the chat room so I can send those to you. And the other thing I would like to say is I'd really like to thank Heidi Tarshish for being a partner with this, with Tomator of St. Paul and Hineni. We are only better when we work together, and we can see that by the diversity of people that are on this call, from people that Heidi was able to reach out to, and so I really, really appreciate that. For those of you who did miss the first session or are interested in receiving a recording of that session, as I said, I'll put my email in the chat room, and I'm happy to send that to you. Before I introduce our speakers, I do just want to say another thank you to Dr. Sheldon Berkowitz, who's the president of the Minnesota chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. The reason we have our two fine speakers today is because he recommended them to me, so I really appreciate that. So thank you so much. Today we have both. We have Dr. Hannah Schachter-Lixon back with us today. Many of you were at her first session. She's a pediatrician and internal medicine doctor in St. Paul. And we have a new speaker with us today, Dr. Nathan Chomillo. Is that right? No, Chomillo.
Yes.
Chomillo. Okay, I should have started practicing a week ago. Okay, Dr. Chomillo. He has a very extensive biography. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about him, and then what I would suggest is you all look him up. He is the medical director for the Minnesota Medicaid and Minnesota Care Program. He practices as a general pediatrician and an internal medicine hospitalist. He is a member of the American Academy of Pediatrics Council in Early Childhood in the section of Minority Health, Equity, and Inclusion, and is one of the early childhood champions for the Minnesota chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. His advocacy work with Reach Out and Read Minnesota and the Minnesota Doctors for Health Equity has been recognized with the 2018 Medical Champion Achievement Award. So we are so thrilled to have you with us today. So welcome, and Dr. Lixon, am I handing it off to you?
Perfect.
Okay.
So welcome back, everybody who's back, and welcome to those of you who weren't here a couple weeks ago when we first met. Like we talked about last time, the goal of our coming together has been, how do we educate our children? How do we talk to our kids about racism? And really this came up because of what's been happening in our world, especially in Minnesota, but is something that's important all the time. So this is meant to be part of an ongoing discussion and ongoing work that we're all doing as we educate ourselves and do our own work, but also in raising our kids and teaching our kids the things they need to know to be excellent members of society. Okay, so just a very small recap, and I know we'll talk about some of the same issues today that we talked about last time. If you weren't here for the first conversation, I would recommend reaching out to Barbie to get a copy of the video so that you can really take some time and read through it and listen to it and see the resources that we shared as well. And that goes for you, Mom and Dad. I don't know if you watched it, but I don't know that you did. So I'm looking at you. So anyway, so just brief recap. We talked about a lot of definitions. So what is racism? What is anti-racism? What are ways that racism is part of our world? and ways that we are part of those racist systems that really define the world we live in. And then what are ways that we can take anti-racist actions to create a less racist or an anti-racist world. One of the things that I think is so important, and that's why I'm just going to start with it today, is the idea of anti-racism. And I think that that is so foundational, especially as we talk to our kids, that being simply a good person is not the answer, right? By being a good person in an environment that is founded on racist principles and racist policies, we continue to endorse and support racism, right? So we need to be working against that tide. And that was a lot of what we talked about last time, or we kind of built to getting to that point in our conversation last time. So today we are going to do what sometimes can seem like an insurmountable task, but talk about how do we then convey these very complex, often emotionally challenging ideas to our kids? How do we educate them about these issues that, for some of us are things we talk about and think about a lot. For some of us are newer issues that we are still grappling with and working to understand ourselves. How do we talk about these issues with our kids? And that is why I needed help, because I'm certainly not an expert on this, though I've had those conversations with my children. But Dr. Nate Chomillo is just, nationally renowned in leading these conversations and teaching adults how to have these conversations. So I just want to say thanks, Nate, for being here. I know that you're very busy with all the things you're doing, and we really appreciate your taking the time to help us. So I think first I'd love to hear from you, Nate, and just kick this off with the question of, how do you define, what you define as being anti-racist? So what's your definition and how do you think about that?
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. And thanks for helping facilitate this conversation. It certainly is. The goal of when I go around and talking is that, you can't solve racism in one talk. It's about getting in your community and getting in your family and having these conversations that feel uncomfortable because of how we've all been raised in the United States to talk about race, or not talk about race, rather. And so I'm really happy to be here and be a part of it. And so when I am talking about anti-racism, I use the analogy that Dr. Chomillo Jones has used in her talks. And so Dr. Chomillo Jones is a physician, researcher. She's the former president of the American Public Health Association. And she talks about, anti-racism and being on one of those like walking moveways at the airport, where you're just kind of standing and it's taking you to your destination. And the way that our society is structured in the US, we are on a walkway that's always moving towards racist outcomes, right? So we can have our head down and not be aware of it. We can have our hands over our eyes and not want to see it. But, if we're not doing anything, if we're just being a good person or just being not racist, as Dr. Nathan kind of referenced, we're still moving towards outcomes that are racist. We are still, in some ways benefiting, in some ways being harmed by these racist structures. And so it doesn't matter if you're Black or if you're white, if you're Native American, Indian, if you're Jewish, Christian, Muslim, gay, or straight, we are all on this moving walkway that is designed to create racist outcomes. And so becoming anti-racist, in her analogy, is, first, if you weren't realizing that you were on the walkway, kind of picking your head up and looking around and seeing the ways that racism works in your life and in the structures and decisions that you make or don't make. And then to become actively anti-racist is turning around and starting to walk the other direction from the way that walkway is carrying you. And in that process, we are likely to kind of bump into people in the walkway who they themselves might have their head down, they themselves might be have their blinders on, and they're going to be asking, why. There's going to be resistance there, right? There's going to be some uncomfortable encounters because they themselves might not yet be aware of how racism works and how they are either benefiting from it or not. And so And so that kind of is a concept, kind of the way I've helped, people conceptualize what it really means to become anti-racist and what it means to become anti-racist in a society that's kind of structured towards racist outcomes.
Thanks for that. How do we bring up this conversation with our kids? How do we get into it? Sometimes our kids are asking us questions and that's a way in. How do you recommend we start? Yeah,
so I think certainly the first thing I usually recommend is when kids do bring it up, starting to become comfortable talking about it. I think a lot of us have been conditioned that race is a kind of a taboo topic to talk about, and so an example I often get is children as young as 3 will start to internalize differences that they see how people are treated based on race. And so they might make comments like, why is that boy's skin so dark, or why are they dirty, or why is my hair so curly? And we can, as parents, our first reaction might be to kind of shut that down, particularly if it's like in the public, in the grocery store, where this happens. And so our first reaction might be to say, oh, we don't talk about that. And so those types of kind of shutting down the conversation sends a message, an indirect message that race is something that they shouldn't be talking about, at least not to adults or grown-ups, and then they just kind of rely on the messages they get from everywhere else in their world. And so the first kind of step is to kind of recognize when those opportunities present themselves to kind of ask what they think, see what they've heard, and then kind of build from there. And I often talk to parents about being the filter through which their children process information and new information and how the world works. And then, some more concrete examples are, it really depends on their age and their development, right? So as pediatricians, we're really trained to kind of talk about and look at child's health through that lens of development and what's, normal for their age. And so, starting with kind of just concepts about fairness initially, and what's fair and what's not, and how certain people don't get treated fairly because of the color of their skin are concepts that you can start to talk about, even as young as 3, 4, 5. And then as they get into school, I think one of the biggest opportunities is to really be actively engaged in what they're learning in school and what they're not learning. I think, in this moment, we are hearing a lot of, I've been really interested to see how many people are now understanding the meaning of Juneteenth, for example. People who are kind of interrogating what the 4th of July means to some and what it means to others. And so, talking more and more about history and the mistakes that have been made and being honest about it, but also then highlighting the people who've been there alongside to help push for change, and it's been people from all backgrounds, and so kind of showing how children themselves can start to have agency is important, and then as they get older and older, you can start to actually have these larger conversations about things like structural racism, like white supremacy, and what those concepts mean, and there's lots of different ways you could do that. There's movies and documentaries that I think have been done really well to kind of help engage, teenagers and parents and other caregivers can kind of watch those along, and then you guys can have a discussion afterwards. Same thing for I really advocate of having a summer book club where the whole family, when you have teenage children, are reading one book, and then you guys get together and talk about it, once a month or twice a month. I remember growing up, Hannah probably does too, the Pizza Hut book it competitions, where you got that free personal pan pizza. Sorry, Pizza Hut's not sponsoring me. It's just a personal reflection. But that really helped drive a lot of interesting conversations. My dad would use that as a way to kind of have us do book reports each month, and then get to go to Pizza Hut and stuff like that. So thinking of ways that you can kind of embed it in stuff that you might be already doing, I think is really helpful.
I'd love to talk a little bit about ways that our kids experience racism. and maybe seeing racism in their own lives. And, you know, certainly our younger kids may not recognize that that's what they're seeing or experiencing, especially our white children. But it is what they're seeing and experiencing, and how we can help name that for them. You know, one thing I talked about with my daughter, and she's only 6, right? So she's just finished her first year in school, is, you know, these kids, even the little ones, they have a sense of what's happening in the world around them, right? So they understand when their parents and the adults around them are stressed, or they hear snippets of the news, they hear snippets of the adult conversations, even if they're not being actively included in those conversations. And so, you know, circling back with our kids and saying, hey, what do you understand, or what have you heard about what's going on? Have you heard the name George Floyd? Do you understand what happened? And making sure we're explaining some of that to them, and then tying it back to their own lives. Like, what's your school like? Why do you think it's like that? What do you notice when kids get in trouble? What do you notice? What are ways, Nate, that you think are an appropriate way of pointing out racism to our kids, of explicitly showing them? What are some easy examples we can use when there isn't a massive, like everyone in their world is talking about the same event? What are some examples that you think are accessible at different age groups to talk about this?
That's a great question. So I think one of the ways that I've heard it kind of described, or kind of recommendations for families, is from Dr. Allison Briscoe-Smith, who does a lot of, she's a psychologist who does a lot of this work, and this is her kind of area of specialty. And she talks about, you know, setting up some family values. And so, you know, even starting as young as 3 or 4, you can start to say, you know, we believe in fairness, right? And that's, you know, a concept, again, that we talked about earlier, that children at that young age can start to understand. And so then when you encounter things that are not fair, you can kind of talk about that. And certainly, as you know, Hannah's talking about, children really understand and pick up on lots of things. And so, you know, there's currently a homelessness crisis, and you know, if you live in the Twin Cities, you're likely to drive by and see someone who's homeless, and you and your family can have kind of a discussion about that, and kind of how your response is going to be, and then kind of talk about, you know, how to, you know, what does it mean to be homeless, what's fair and what's not, and kind of use that to kind of then down the road, you'll start to see that, oh, that there's not fairness in how people are treated based on the color of their skin. And so certainly as they get older, really kind of looking at the language we use about, you know, even sometimes it comes to like language we use about ourselves, and like, you know, we have this nice house because mommy and daddy worked hard, right? And we've done well, and or grandpa and grandma worked hard and we've done well. But, you know, you need to also acknowledge that just because someone else doesn't live in a nice house doesn't necessarily mean their parents aren't working hard, right? There's certain institutions and opportunities that weren't supportive of large parts of our population, right? And so we can kind of inadvertently kind of hold up racism by kind of this idea that, you know, if you don't have the nice things, you're lazy, right? Or, you know, there's these ideas that, that certain people just in certain communities don't have the same values, and that's really, you know, not the case. And so kind of looking for those kind of more specific experiences as you're kind of going out and around the town, to kind of discuss, you know, fairness and how racism might work. I really like that open-ended question that you're, you know, using there, Hannah, of, you know, how do you see who's in your school or who's in your class, and, you know, who's getting in trouble and what are they doing, and kind of starting to point out those, you know, day-to-day things that, you know, kids do notice differences. And then the last, you know, piece that was really important that you brought up there is the kind of going back to it. And children are often like, you'll have a conversation with them, and they'll keep thinking about it, and they'll keep thinking about it. And so it's really helpful to, you know, in a couple of days, you know, as you yourself are thinking about it, maybe, you know, open the conversation. And this is usually a bit older for older children, but, you know, even school age kids can kind of follow this too and say, remember when we were talking about how kids aren't treated fair at school? I was thinking about, why that is, and wondering if, you think it's just all teachers or one teacher, and what are you thinking about it? And kind of coming back to them and seeing what they've been thinking about since, seeing if maybe they talked to like a friend at school or a teacher at school and got like some information that you're like, oh, or you're like, oh, wow, that's a really interesting, enlightening kind of take. And so, kind of keeping that conversation, making it an ongoing thing, and not just kind of like all right, we've had our race talk, we're not going to talk about it again for another year or two, or until something comes up.
One of the things I've heard from people is how can I possibly explain any of this when I'm still don't feel like I understand it, or I don't feel like I am, like I'm still doing the work. How can I teach this effectively? Or am I just going to screw up my kid by saying the wrong thing?
Yeah, and I think I think racism is not the only area where parents feel like that. Right? As pediatricians, we know that there's a lot of concerns about, do I know how to feed a toddler? Do I know how to really train them to go to the bathroom on their own? There's a lot of parts of children's development that parents are kind of learning as we're going, and I think it's okay to do that here too. I think we often talk to parents about it's good to model how you're dealing with your own emotions, right? And that it's good to talk about, mommy, daddy is angry now, or frustrated, or sad, or tired, and let them see how you deal with it, and so that they can kind of learn to deal with their emotions similarly. And I think this is a similar, case where you can kind of talk about, the pieces that you feel comfortable about, but kind of acknowledge that. And I often acknowledge in my talks that I don't know everything, and I've learned a lot in the last 4 or 5 years, and talk about it much differently now than I did back then, and that's going to be kind of a continued evolution. And so I think just being open with kids that this is something that we're all kind of learning about, and for adults, a lot of it is unlearning, right? And having to kind of unlearn some things that we've been kind of taught either directly or indirectly through the course of growing up in the United States.
So one thing we touched on a little bit last time, but I think this is a good time to revisit it, is and this came from our discussion of the concept of white fragility, but the dichotomy that a lot of us who are white make between racist as bad and not racist as good. And so when we are confronted with an action we have made or taken, or an action, the lack of action that we have taken, or something we may have said, and someone identifies that to us as racist, or identifies to us that we are part of and benefiting from a racist structure or a racist policy, that because we then internalize racist as bad and not racist as good, we feel we're being told we're a bad person. When that is not actually what we're being told. We're being told that we are benefiting from a racist policy, or we have said something that is racist, and it is different, right? And I know we talked about that last time. How do we make sure, because I know I'm not the only person who grew up feeling that way, and I want to make sure that I'm not raising my kids that way, and yet our kids can be very concrete thinkers, especially when they're young. Something's either good or it's bad. How do we shift that conversation to be either, I think I love the way you talked, Dr. Chomillo, sorry, I call you Nate, so I'm working to be formal with you today. But, to be fair, not fair. Like, oh, that statement you said wasn't fair, instead of that was me. So do you think that would be the right way to frame it instead for our kids? What do you think is the right approach there?
Yeah, I think having kids reflect on their day and see if there's things that happened that they felt weren't fair or not someone wasn't kind to them, or something didn't go, someone didn't share a toy with them or something like that, and kind of talk to them how that made them feel, and kind of use those kind of instances to start to kind of talk about how, it might not be that that person was, inherently being mean. They didn't realize that impact. And I think it certainly is important to both here again model how you and kind of reflect on your own feelings in the situation, and share that with your children as far as I realize that me being a part of so like even talking about like, school, like you were talking about with schools and who shows up in the schools, and like, we want you to have the best education possible, but, that doesn't mean everyone has that, and that's not fair. And that's something that, we have to take into consideration when we like decisions on where we're sending you to school, and how we can then work in other ways to, really help undo that unfairness. And so I think that piece of, self-reflection is really important there. I think you're right. Like, and I think there's some grace you have to give yourself, right? Like we're going to make mistakes along the way. And so, starting to give yourself your grace in this process can hopefully help you see that, when becoming anti-racist, like even Dr. Ibram Kendi, who's, like the national expert now, says that no one is actually ever truly anti-racist. It's something that we can strive towards. But that we have periods where we are anti-racist and supporting anti-racist, and some periods where we might slip into kind of supporting more racist ideas and outcomes intentionally or unintentionally. And so I think starting to kind of see everything kind of that we do, and then help our kids see that as well. And so that's probably conversation for like a bit older, right? Like these concepts are abstract enough for adults to kind of wrap their minds around, let alone trying to tell a child. But I think the American Academy of Pediatrics policy statement kind of cited the raising resistors approach, which really kind of talks about first what's fair and what's not, and then also kind of identifying whether race is the thing at play or not, because not every unfairness or injustice in our society is structured around race. I mean, race is kind of embedded in all of them, but it's not necessarily the main driver. There's sexism, there's certainly prosecution based on your faith or your sexuality, or other things like that. And so I think being able to kind of start helping our children tease apart, what is the actual cause of the unfairness is a certainly important part of how we can kind of get away from, the thing that everything's about race, which means that like if I get called a racist, it's like the end of the world. And trying to hold those two things at the same time definitely takes some time.
So I want to dive into a couple things next, but I want to take a break here, or a pause, and hear from some of you all if you're comfortable asking a question, if you have questions to ask specifically. I'd also love to hear if any of you have had these conversations with the children in your lives, and what you felt like went well, or what you felt like was hard, what types of questions your kids had. Because I think for me, one of the most interesting things in having these conversations, especially with my 6-year-old, not so much with my 4-year-old yet, has been the questions she asks that then challenge me, like, whoa, I didn't know we were going down that path. I wasn't mentally prepared for that, but here we go. And I'll share more of that, but I'm more interested right now to hear what conversations you've had, or what experiences you've had, or questions you have about those experiences, if there are any. So I'll tell you a little bit about a conversation I had with my daughter. We were talking about George Floyd, and she'd heard a lot of stuff about the news and just us talking. And so I explained what had happened in broad terms, that the police had killed him even though he hadn't done anything wrong. And she said, oh, I knew about taking people to jail, but I didn't know about killing. And I said, okay, yeah. And what, you know, and so it brought up a conversation. It then led to how police target people or see people as being criminal because of the color of their skin. More often when their skin is darker than if it's white skin. And she said, is that for kids too, or just for grown-ups? Which led to, are there jails for kids? Which led to a conversation about the school to prison pipeline with my 6-year-old, right? And that was not what I was intending to have a conversation about, but that's what she wanted to have a conversation about. And I didn't answer questions she didn't ask. I answered the questions she asked at as well of a developmentally appropriate level as I could. But I think that's really important. And we talk about this when we talk with parents about answering questions about reproduction and how babies are made, right? You know, you answer the question your kids ask. You don't withhold, you don't lie. Don't give them a ton of information they're not asking for, because that if they're not asking the question, they may not be ready for the answer. But make sure you're answering the questions that they do have. Otherwise, they're going to make it up, or they're going to hear from somebody else, or they're going to speculate. And so it's better that we give them facts. So I have a comment in here about a situation in the grocery store, a toddler, a 3-year-old, loudly asking why a person is fat. How do we handle that situation? We talked about that a little bit, Nate, about like not just blowing off and saying we don't talk about it, but what would be your response?
Yeah, I think you would, ask them why they think that, right? Like as a first starter, and see, what they tell you. You could also ask, like, where have you heard that before? And kind of start to get a better idea of, what is some of the, is it a TV show that you thought was really benign and just silly, and that your children are picking up that type of message from the TV show, or was it from a relative, or a babysitter, or so it's helpful to kind of start understanding where they're getting those messages from, and then you want to kind of say talk about body size, like you would talk about skin. We're all made to different heights and different body sizes, and so explain that certainly depending on and again, I think this is where it gets to perfectly with like what you were just saying. Like you could, go all down this line of like, oh, and it depends on like what you eat, and like, that's why you eat fruits and vegetables, but like if they're not asking those type of questions, like maybe they'll say, okay, but like, how do you get bigger? Or, and then you can like have that conversation, but, try to keep it very much simple, as like we come in different shapes and sizes, just like we come in different heights. And, you can kind of reference, kids at school, like, oh, how, or preschool or wherever they see other kids, like how, Billy or Hamad is like taller than you, but you guys are like the same age. That's, the same thing here. So I think kind of first interrogating where they might have heard that message, so you can, do a better job. I shouldn't say better, but you can just, go back and look and find out where that messaging is coming from in the first place, and then kind of answer it in kind of a very broad terms. And then if they have more questions, continue, as you were demonstrating there, Hannah, to kind of answer those. But most often at that age, you kind of answer it once, and they might then be distracted by the next thing they see and kind of go on. And so you don't need to kind of go into a deep dive at that point.
Carrie, did you have something you wanted to say? I noticed you unmuted.
Yeah, if that's okay, to your question before. So I have 2 kids. My younger one is about 3, but my 5-year-old is asking a lot of questions. We live about 8 blocks from the 3rd precinct, so we're really kind of in the middle of everything. So it's really been all over. So we have a ton of businesses that have really beautiful murals up, and my 5-year-old he's just fixated on skin color and his observations about skin color. And when I talk about somebody Black, he says, well, that person's brown. And then there's a mural that it's 10 feet tall and it has George Floyd and his skin is blue. Well, Mom, why is his skin blue there? And then so many people in our community have up really welcoming signs. So we have a ton of Black Lives Matter signs and all are welcome here, and Martin Luther King, and just, it's endless questioning and really a fixation on the actual color that he's seeing. And I think it's because I'm talking about color so much that he's focused on it, but I can't really explain. I mean, some of that is just beyond what I feel like I'm able to explain, but yeah, it's been a lot for the 5-year-old to take in, and every single sign he sees in a front lawn, he asks what it is, wants to know kind of the history behind it, and yeah, and then just this fixation on actual skin tone, what he's seeing. He asked me once, he wanted to see an actual picture of George Floyd, so I pulled up a picture on my phone, and he's like, well, that looks a little different than what I saw on the street. So I don't know if there's anything I can do to explain kind of past that next level of what he's actually seeing with very specific skin tones, or if I need to wait for him to ask, like, what does that mean, rather than just what he's seeing with his eyes.
Yeah, so one book I highly recommend, all pediatricians and all parents read is Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria by Dr. Beverly Tatum. And she wrote that over 10 years ago, and it's still so true today. And in it, and in subsequent interviews, if you listen to her talk, she gives the example of her own 4-year-old son. I think making that comment in the grocery store about why is that man's skin so dirty, or something to that effect. And she, at 4 years of age, talked to her son about melanin and how, his skin is darker because it has more melanin in it. And that we have different shades based off of different amounts of melanin, and, kind of liking it till you have different colors of hair, you have different colors of eyes. And so that's just, how we are made, and how people are a little different, but inside and overall we are all the same, right? So but that's kind of one of the differences our eyes see, and so having a conversation even just about melanin at that young of an age is something that they can kind of start to wrap their mind around. And then certainly when you get into kind of like the artisticness of all those different murals, you can kind of talk about people trying to have different, modes of expression, through art. And that's kind of like a separate conversation. But I think certainly, as they're talking about that, I think that's kind of the place you can start. And then it really is normal at that age. It's kind of similar to a bit younger when they first start noticing everything has a color, right? Like, I think it's kind of a fun time with like, oh, this is blue and this is green, because I now have like the language to kind of to describe the world around me, and so I'm going to use it and kind of check in with my parents who really help clarify or confirm if I'm using it the right way. And so that kind of level of interest is certainly, I think, normal. And so certainly it would be kind of just leaning into and kind of continuing to give him the kind of language to explore his world and understand what's going on around.
Thank you. Thanks for that question and for the answer. I think it's about our kids go through developmental stages, and the way they process the world and understand the world changes over time. And I agree. I mean, early on we talked to our daughter about, people with pink skin and people with brown skin, because that's the colors our skins really are. We're not white, and people aren't black. And it was confusing to her if we said that they were. And now she understands that we use those terms to signify something that is different than the actual color. But it all depends on the age of your kid and the way they see the world. And so it's fitting in these explanations in a context, in a something that fits within their conceptualization of the world around them, which changes day to day, as everyone knows. There's a great question here that I want to bring up, which is, you know, how do we explain to our kids, you know, we're talking about our values as families, as parents, as grandparents, how do we explain to our kids, and how important is it that we explain to them that not everybody shares values? And how do we do that?
That's a great one. And I think, you know, that's something that I'm certainly no expert in that piece of it, that conversation alone. I think we all kind of will have to figure that part out. But, you know, I would say it certainly helps to, you know, be able to reflect on it yourself and then, you know, give examples of how you are living out the values that you and your family say you are, and that other people have, you know, different values, and that, you know, can be okay. I think, you know, I'm reminded of this quote that's, you know, attributed to James Baldwin, but I recently learned it's actually by a different writer who goes by the Twitter name Son of Baldwin. But it's, you know, we can have disagreement and still be friends as long as your disagreement's not rooted in my oppression and right to live, right? And so I think, you know, having that lens of like, we have values and other people have values that are different. And as long as, you know, our values aren't rooted in, you know, oppressing someone else, you know, simply for being, and aren't, you know, harming someone else, and other people's values aren't harming, you know, other people or us, you know, that's okay to be different and have, you know, these different approaches. And so I think, you know, that's obviously conversation that takes time. And again, trying to first find how you really are modeling the values that you say that your family are part of is, I think, helpful, because then you can then easier see how other families' values might be lived out, where those differences are, where those similarities are, and kind of build from there.
We have a question here about how do we talk to our kids about the police? And that's a really good question, and it's a tough question. It's tough, and yet it's not. But, you know, I'll start by saying that if we circle back to the idea of fairness, we can talk about how the actions police take aren't fair to people based on the color of their skin. And so that's one way of getting into that conversation. But Nate, what thoughts do you have on how we should be navigating those conversations with our kids?
Yeah, I mean, I think the temptation would be to kind of go right to the good and bad. And, you know, I think it's, even amongst our kind of younger kids, there can be some harm because they'll just latch on to kind of one or the other, and, you know, say that, you know, some, you know, police are supposed to kind of protect us and help us. And sometimes they do that, and sometimes they don't, as kind of like that starter kind of conversation. And then, you know, as they get older, you know, I think it is helpful, like we were talking about earlier, to really kind of look into the history of, you know, why we have police, you know, what were police initially intended for and who they intended to police, and how that's developed over time. And then start to, you know, have those conversations about how, you know, even police are trained and how they're not trained, and kind of start to interrogate that with your older children. I think there's also some space to kind of point out where police aren't, right? And you know, what communities don't have a lot of policing, and what do those communities do have, right? And like, you can start to talking about opportunities, right? Opportunities for health and education and housing and safety, and how people have those opportunities. They don't need to interact with the police as much. And so I think kind of, you know, starting to kind of have that conversation about, you know, what are the police's intended role, what is their actual, you know, impact, and how do, you know, police interact with different communities differently, why that's, you know, fair and not fair, and kind of, again, build it up. And certainly, depending on your kid's age, you might start right away with that kind of history piece. But otherwise, you might be starting to talk about just, again, what's their intended role, serve and protect, but do they do that for everyone all the time? And then, you know, I think it's certainly important to kind of acknowledge where your child, you know, falls in that, right? And so like or at least think about where they fall, because you know, the next question very well might be, well, you know, what am I supposed to do if I see the police? Or, you know, what am I supposed to do if I'm with a friend who is Black or brown and the police come, and kind of help, you know, yourself think through, like, what would you know, want them to do, and then also help talk them through that situation. I think the more we can kind of talk and through and have them think through and connect it to, you know, the people in their lives that might be impacted by it, I think that will help them better understand some of these conversations.
That brings me to a great transition point, because in order for me to say to my daughter, you know, well, imagine if you and your friend Naomi were playing and you were doing the same thing, you were both doing the same naughty behavior, and your teacher gave you a warning, but Naomi had a timeout. Would that be fair? But I can use that real life example because she has a friend at her school who is Black. And not everybody does. And that is because we have really significant structural racism in our very own community, and it affects our kids and it affects the way that they're being raised in their realities. So what are some ways, Nate, that we can, you know, dismantle whatever language you want to use, that we can be anti-racist in a way that improves our kids' lives and their experiences?
Yeah, and so I thank you for kind of pointing out that, you know, and even in Minnesota, or especially in Minnesota in some states, instances, we are hyper-segregated, right? And so that is what really, you know, when I'm talking to pediatricians and teachers, in particular for early childhood, where you are so concrete, and there is this transductive reasoning is the kind of concept of, well, if I know one person who looks like this, and this is the characteristic I'm going to assign them or be told is assigned to them, then everyone that looks like that has that characteristic, right? So if someone tells me that, you know, all Black people are really good at jumping, then I'm going to think that of all Black people. And if someone tells me that, you know, all white people are really good at reading, I'm going to think that of all white people, right? And those are the messages I'm hearing. That's just how my worldview gets created if I don't have someone within my social circles to kind of disrupt that. And so, you know, certainly trying to find ways and activities and you know, play groups or, you know, extracurricular, you know, swim classes or other things that have more diverse participation is really important. And so, you know, certainly if you are blessed with, you know, more means, and this is something kind of I challenge my pediatric colleagues and physician colleagues in particular, is kind of thinking about, you know, not only, you know, where you live, but, you know, the extracurricular groups. Is it still just within your, you know, mostly white community, or do you have opportunities to kind of go have your kids participate in, you know, exploring clubs, swimming classes, you know, music lessons in communities that are more diverse, and so they start to get some of that exposure, and you yourself start to get, you know, more of that exposure. Certainly harder during COVID-19. I had a question like, how do you do that virtually? And I haven't figured that out just yet, because there's aren't a lot of great virtual kind of get-togethers yet that I've seen, but certainly something to kind of think of and come back to. I think then the next step is, you know, the books, the TV shows, the media that our children are exposed to is really important. And so really having a really diverse set of books you're reading. And I think it's, you know, we talk about books and media as kind of both mirrors and windows. And so, you know, mirrors so that you can see yourself in it and your own story and your family story. Windows so you can look into other people's families and stories and see similarities, but also see how you are different. And so trying to have really, you know, diverse characters, because then you can, you know, maybe you don't have the person in their preschool class to talk to a reference, but you could talk about, you remember that book we read where this happened to Maria, or this book you had where this, you know, happened to Hamza, and kind of they can then start making those connections, and then thinking about the same thing with, whatever TV shows are really their favorite, trying to find some with some diverse representation that they are watching more consistently, that again give them some better points of reference that aren't all just through the white lens.
And I want to add on to that a little bit, because I think there's a big difference between, say, going to swimming lessons or soccer or something like that at a community center that has more racial diversity, and then actually developing meaningful relationships with the people you meet there. Because our kids notice the difference between maybe going to that place, but then if the friends that are invited over to your home are still only white, they notice that too. And so it's important that that's on us as the adults to develop those relationships and make it more meaningful than just exposure. And we certainly don't want to be diversity tourists, right? So we want, if we're engaging with the community, we want to be investing in that community and supporting that community as well in whatever way they identify that need. And that could just be, I'm, signing up for this class in this community center, and so my money's going to that community center to support their programming. But the more meaningful and lasting you can build relationships, the more that really makes a difference, because our kids see the way we live too. And so make sure we're modeling those behaviors. I have a couple really good questions in here. One of them was about, what's a better response when a kid points, a 7-year-old on the playground points out, that kid has black skin, instead of saying we're all the same, because we know that, yes, on the one hand, we're all the same, but our experiences are different because we live in a racist society. So our experience of the world is different based on the color of our skin. Even though, yes, we are all inherently the same. How do you respond to that in a way that doesn't minimize the experience? And so I'll pass that on.
Yeah, it might sound kind of like a broken record, but I think it's an important concept to kind of really understand, because I think so much of our kind of fear of being labeled racist is around, like, even just pointing out that race exists, right, and that there's difference amongst us. And so it very may well be that child's intent wasn't to anything harm. They were just, making the observation. And so, it's really helpful to have our first response be one of questioning, like, well, oh, yeah, they are. Why did you notice that? Or what does that make you think of? And then kind of interrogate that from there, and really kind of help them kind of reflect through, why they wanted to point that out in the first place. But I think it is really important to not adopt this colorblind approach of, like, I treat everyone the same, or I treat everyone equally, and that's like enough to be labeled, not racist, and that's okay, because you may do that, but our systems and structures don't. And again, doing some of this work that you guys are all doing right now on yourselves will help you start to have the language to talk about, if you ask your 7-year-old, why did they point that out, then they will say, well, all black kids are this, and they kind of share a stereotype that they may have heard, and then you can kind of challenge that and kind of correct that. And then also, they might also say, like, oh, someone told me this joke about black kids are on the playground, and then that's kind of an opportunity to kind of help them, talk them through, what it means to be anti-racist, right? And it means that, like, they don't just sit by and then repeat that later. It's like you actually kind of push back and say, that's not right, and this is why. And then so kind of helping them, using those moments to help them kind of both understand and process what they've heard, and then kind of plan for the future. So there's one book that I really been recommending a lot in this time. It's Something Happened in Our Town, and there's an animated version of it too on YouTube, which is really nice. And it talks about a police shooting where a man was killed in a community, and it goes and kind of shows, I think, at 3 different family dinner tables what the conversation is about what happened. And then it ends with those different kids coming together on the playground and, you know, witnessing kind of a racist, bigoted act, and then kind of pushing back and you know, kind of learning and kind of blending all the different kind of pieces that they learned from their families into that response. And so I think that's kind of an example of how, like, when we, you know, have these conversations, well, we can kind of both see where our children are at, but then also help them prepare to kind of encounter this stuff in the future.
Thank you. You know, I know we're coming up to the end of our hour here. We just have a few more minutes, and I don't know that we'll be able to get to every single question or comment that came, but one that I really like and I appreciate, especially when we're talking about older school age kids and adolescents, is what if the kids don't seem receptive to this conversation? And that's where I find parenting is an art and none of us know how to do it. But you know, you just got to push. You just got to keep doing it and talk about it, and they'll hear you. Even if they're not engaging, they still hear you. And that's where I really like I wonder statements. I think those are a great tool in forcing or encouraging kids to think, is I wonder why. Because then you're not pushing them, you're not asking them to answer the question, you're just creating a framework for them to think about an issue. I wonder why that happened. I wonder why so-and-so was suspended. I wonder why your dance class only has kids with white skin in it. I wonder why. And it makes them think about things that maybe they hadn't thought about before. So I just wanted to share that. That's one of my favorite parenting hacks. And then another question came up, and I just want to touch on it real briefly, is the question of anti-Semitism and how do we frame that in talking with our kids too. And we talked a little bit about the concept of intersectionality last time, but I think this is a great, you know, opportunity to talk about that again. You know, so yes, absolutely, anti-Semitism is real, and this is how it has affected perhaps me or my family or our community. And also racism is real. Now imagine if you were someone who is both Jewish and experiencing anti-Semitism, and Black and experiencing racism. And I think it using any personal experience a child has as being not part of that mainstream group creates an opportunity to talk about racism as well. One mistake that we can make if we identify as part of a group who has experienced oppression or not the dominant culture is by saying that's enough, because it's not enough, okay? It's not enough to understand what it feels like to be the victim of anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic thoughts, because we're still white and we still live in a racist society. Even though, yes, anti-Semitism is real, so is racism. And so we can't just leave it there, even though it's real. We need to still understand that intersectionality exists too, and that we still have work to do. So I just wanted to share that. So any final questions or thoughts from folks before we break? I saw a question for session number 3. I have no idea. We'll certainly need to keep talking about this. Like Nate said, this isn't, we had the race talk and we're done. This is we're on that moving walkway, and unless we're actively walking the other direction, we're being pulled towards racism, okay? And so we have to do that constant work to walk the opposite direction. We're gonna be bumping elbows and tripping over people, and they're gonna be saying, oop, 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 you know, but we gotta keep doing it.
Thank you. On behalf of all of us, I just want to thank both of you for giving of your time, which I know is a very, very precious commodity, and sharing of yourselves and your honesty and your knowledge and your expertise, and for being with us in such a caring, open way that I feel I can speak for a lot of us, that makes learning and looking at hard things much more possible. And I think that's what we all have to do. And you have created a forum to help us do that. And as we all know, it's the very beginning. And I know hopefully we will all do our part. And I am committed for the St. Paul JCC to continue offering sessions and learning, and God willing, being back in person with real people to talk these things through. So that's my commitment, and I know each of you will go away today with also a commitment. And I also just want to say how grateful I am to have such resources in our city. So thank you both for being part of our incredible community, and thank you for sharing yourselves with us. And thank you all for being here today. So take care, keep learning, stay safe, wash your hands, and wear your mask. Take care.
Please.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. Take care.
All right. Bye.